Sometimes the person you trust most becomes the one who hurts you deepest. Sometimes your most loyal friend ain't even human. Jedidiah Cain was a mountain man with a broken spine and a broken heart. His wife Clara had cared for him through hard winters and harder days, but on a cliff above Deadman's Bluff, she wheeled him to the edge and let go. As Jed fell towards certain death, his German shepherd Duke lunged forward, grabbing his coat and refusing to let his master die. What followed was pure survival. Duke guided the paralyzed man through canyons and cliffs, back toward the town that had forgotten him. But what dark secret drove Clara to such betrayal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air carried memories like smoke from a dying fire, thin and bitter in the early morning light. Jedidiah Cain had awakened to the same view. For 3 years now, the jagged peaks of the Montana Rockies stretching toward heaven, indifferent to the broken man who watched them through his cabin window. His hands, once strong enough to break a wild horse or fell a tree with an axe, now rested uselessly in his lap as Clara moved about the kitchen behind him. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the small cabin, mixing with the scent of pine that seeped through every crack in the log walls. Duke, his German shepherd, lay beside the wheelchair, amber eyes alert despite his advanced age. The dog's greying muzzle spoke of years spent in these mountains, tracking game and standing guard through countless storms. Now he spent his days as Jed did, watching, waiting, remembering better times. Clara's wedding ring caught the morning light as she reached for the coffee pot. The simple gold band had been Jed's grandmother's, passed down through generations of mountain folk who understood that love meant enduring whatever hardships the wilderness threw at you. She still wore it, though Jed sometimes caught her twisting it nervously when she thought he wasn't looking. "Coffee's ready," Clara said, her voice carrying that careful neutrality she'd adopted since the accident. She was still beautiful at 42, her auburn hair only lightly touched with silver, but something had changed in her green eyes. The spark that had made every cowboy in Millfield turn his head when she walked past the saloon had dimmed to barely glowing embers. Jed nodded, accepting the steaming cup with hands that trembled slightly. The coffee was strong, the way mountain folk made it strong enough to wake the dead or keep a man alert through a night watch. "Thank you kindly," he said, the words formal and distant. They'd been saying please and thank you to each other for months now, like polite strangers sharing a stagecoach. Duke lifted his head as Clara moved past, tail giving a half-hearted wag. The dog had always been partial to Clara, but lately he seemed to sense the tension that filled the cabin like smoke from a green wood fire. Animals knew things, Jed had learned. They felt the currents that humans tried to hide beneath words and manners. Outside, the morning sun painted the peaks in shades of gold and rose. Jed remembered when he could saddle up before dawn and ride these ridges until sunset, checking traplines and hunting elk in the high meadows. He'd been born to this life, raised by a father who'd taught him to read sign and weather, to respect the mountains while never fearing them. The wilderness had been his church, his livelihood, his very identity. Then came that October morning 3 years past, when Thunder, his prize stallion, had spooked at a rattlesnake. The horse had been magnificent, 16 hands of pure muscle and spirit, coal black with a white blaze down his nose. Jed had raised him from a colt, broken him with patience instead of force. But even the gentlest horse could turn, deadly when fear took hold. The fall had happened in seconds. One moment Jed was in the saddle, feeling the familiar rhythm of Thunder's gait as they climbed toward Eagle Pass. The next, he was airborne, then crashing against a granite outcrop with a sound like breaking kindling. The pain had been immediate and overwhelming, shooting through his spine like lightning. Then nothing, no feeling below his waist. No response when he tried to move his legs. Duke had found him first, the dogs howling echoing off the canyon walls, until Clara and Doc Peterson arrived with a makeshift stretcher. The ride back to town had been agony, every jolt and bump sending fire through Jed's broken body. Doc Peterson, who'd been setting bones and delivering babies in these mountains for 30 years, had done his best. But some things couldn't be fixed with laudanum and splints. "Your spine's cracked like a green branch," the old doctor had said, not unkindly but without false hope. "The good Lord might see fit to give you some healing, but I wouldn't count on walking again, son." Clara had taken the news like a physical blow, her face going white as fresh snow. But she'd stayed. Through the months of pain and helplessness, through his rages and black moods, through the long nights when he'd stared at the ceiling and wondered why God had seen fit to break a man who'd never asked for anything but the chance to live free in his creation. The town had helped at first. Neighbors brought food and offered prayers. The preacher visited regularly, reading scripture and talking about God's mysterious plans. But charity has a way of wearing thin when the need stretches on, and gradually the visitors became fewer. People had their own troubles, their own families to worry about. The mountain didn't stop being dangerous just because Jed Cain couldn't walk anymore. Clara had taken work at the general store, her pride swallowed for the sake of keeping food on their table. Mrs. Henderson, the store owner, was kind enough to let her leave when Jed needed tending, but Jed could see the strain in Clara's shoulders, the way she moved through their cabin like she was walking underwater. The worst part wasn't the helplessness or the pain that still shot through his legs like phantom lightning. It was watching Clara fade, bit by bit, day by day. She'd been the brightest star in Millfield's sky once, the saloon girl who could make a cowboy forget his troubles with just a smile. Men had competed for her attention like roosters in a barnyard, but she'd chosen Jed, the quiet mountain man who preferred elk sign to bar fights. "I see something in you," she'd told him on their wedding night, her fingers tracing the scars on his hands from years of hard living. "Something solid, like these mountains." Now he felt more like a landslide. All that solidity turned to rubble and debris. Duke shifted beside the wheelchair, pressing his warm flank against Jed's leg. The dog couldn't understand why his master no longer hiked the ridges or checked the trap lines, but his loyalty never wavered. Every morning he brought Jed his boots, dropping them beside the wheelchair with the patient hope that today might be the day they'd walk together again. "Storm coming," Clara said, looking out the window toward the western peaks. Dark clouds were building over Devil's Backbone, the jagged ridge that marked the boundary of their valley. "Might be the last big one before winter sets in proper." Jed nodded, reading the signs in the way the wind shifted and the way Duke's ears pricked toward the distant thunder. A lifetime in these mountains had taught him to respect the weather. Storms in the high country could bury a man faster than an avalanche, turning familiar trails into death traps. "We've got enough supplies," Clara continued, checking their stores of coffee and beans. "Shouldn't need to go to town for another week or two." The casual way she said it made Jed's chest tighten. Time was they'd planned supply runs together, making it a social occasion to visit with neighbors and catch up on news. Now Clara went alone, pushing his wheelchair over the rough trail to town when the weather allowed. He'd become cargo, something to be transported rather than a partner in the journey. Duke suddenly stood, ears alert, and pointed toward the door. His tail wasn't wagging. Instead, he'd taken the stance Jed recognized from hunting, muscles coiled and ready. Someone was coming up the trail. "Expecting anyone?" Jed asked, though he already knew the answer. Visitors were rare these days, and most folks had the courtesy to holler before approaching a mountain man's cabin. Clara shook her head, moving to the window with steps that had grown too careful, too measured. "Don't recognize the horse," she said after a moment. "Looks like Doc Peterson's mare, but he's got someone with him." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the creak of saddle leather and the jingle of spurs. Whoever was coming wasn't trying to hide their approach, which was good manners in country where surprising a man on his own property could lead to gunplay. Duke moved to the door, not growling but clearly alert. The dog had always been a good judge of character, friendly with those who meant no harm but fierce when he sensed trouble. His behavior now suggested caution rather than alarm, but Jed had learned to trust the animal's instincts. A knock came at the door, firm but respectful. "Jed, Clara, it's Doc Peterson. Got someone here who'd like a word with you." Clara looked at Jed, a question in her green eyes. He nodded, and she moved to open the door. Doc Peterson stood on their small porch, his medical bag in one hand and his hat in the other. Beside him stood a man Jed didn't recognize, tall and lean, with the kind of mustache that suggested military service and clothes that marked him as a city man trying to look frontier appropriate. "Come in, Doc," Clara said, stepping aside. "Coffee's fresh." Peterson entered with the easy familiarity of an old friend, but his companion hesitated on the threshold, taking in the cabin's modest furnishings and Jed's wheelchair with eyes that tried to be polite but couldn't hide their calculation. "Jed, Clara," Peterson said, settling his considerable bulk into their best chair, "I'd like you to meet Mr. Harrison Blackwood. He's come up from Denver with a proposition that might interest you." Blackwood removed his hat, revealing hair slicked back with pomade and eyes the color of winter ice. "Mr. Cain, Mrs. Cain, I apologize for the intrusion, but I believe we have business to discuss." The man's voice carried the crisp pronunciation of education and money, but there was something underneath it that made Duke's hackles rise slightly. Jed had met men like Blackwood before. Usually they wanted something that wasn't for sale. "What kind of business?" Jed asked, his voice neutral but his eyes sharp. 3 years of helplessness had taught him to read people carefully, to look for the subtle signs that separated honest folk from those who meant harm. Blackwood reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, thick with papers and official-looking documents. "Your land, Mr. Cain, all 800 acres of it. I represent certain interests who are prepared to make you a very generous offer." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind picking up outside and the distant rumble of approaching thunder. Clara's wedding ring caught the light again as her hand went to her throat, and Jed noticed how her face had gone pale. In the growing storm light, with a stranger sitting in their cabin talking about buying their home, Jed felt something shift in the air around them, something that made Duke press closer to his wheelchair and made Clara's green eyes fill with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The mountains outside remained unchanged, eternal and indifferent. But inside their small cabin, Jed could feel the foundations of their life beginning to crack like ice under spring sun. Blackwood spread the documents across Clara's kitchen table like a gambler laying down a winning hand. The papers rustled in the draft from the door, and Jed could see official seals and numbers that made his chest tighten with unease. Duke remained pressed against his wheelchair, the dog's instincts clearly telling him something wasn't right about this smooth-talking stranger. $50,000, Blackwood said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd made this speech before. "Cash money, no conditions, no delays. You sign these papers today, and I'll have a bank draft in your hands before sunset." The sum hit the cabin like a thunderclap. 50,000 was more money than most mountain folk saw in a lifetime. It was enough to buy a fine house in Denver, enough to live comfortably for years without Clara having to work at the general store or worry about their dwindling savings. Clara's intake of breath was sharp and sudden. Her wedding ring caught the light as her fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white with tension. Jed could see the calculation in her green eyes, the quick mental arithmetic of a woman who'd been counting pennies for 3 years. "That's a generous offer," Doc Peterson said carefully, glancing between Jed and the papers. "Mighty generous for land this far from town." Blackwood smiled, the expression not reaching his ice-colored eyes. "The railroad is coming through, Doctor, sooner than most folks realize. This valley will be worth 10 times what I'm offering within 5 years." I'm prepared to pay premium prices now to avoid complications later. Jed studied the man's face, reading the subtle tells that a lifetime in the wilderness had taught him to recognize. Blackwood was lying not about the money, but about his reasons. The railroad talk was plausible enough, but there was something deeper driving this offer, something that made the man's fingers drum nervously against his thigh. "What kind of complications?" Jed asked, his voice level but carrying an edge that made Duke's ears prick forward. "Oh, the usual business disputes," Blackwood replied with a wave of his manicured hand. "Property lines, water rights, grazing permits. Much simpler to purchase clear title from the current owners than to sort through legal tangles later." It was a smooth answer, practiced and reasonable. But Jed noticed how Blackwood's eyes shifted away when he spoke, how his fingers moved to adjust his collar, small signs of deception that a man learned to read when his life depended on knowing friend from foe. Clara was still staring at the papers, her face pale but her eyes bright with possibilities Jed could almost see spinning through her mind. $50,000 would buy her freedom from this cabin, from the daily burden of caring for a broken man, from the slow, grinding poverty that had worn away her youth like water on stone. "This is our home," Jed said quietly, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair. "Been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built this cabin with his own hands, cut every log from trees he felled himself. I understand the sentimental value, Mr. Cain," Blackwood said, his tone suggesting he understood no such thing. "But sentiment doesn't pay for medical care or put food on the table. A man in your situation needs to think practically about the future." The words hung in the air like the scent of approaching storm. "A man in your situation." The phrase was delivered with careful politeness, but its meaning was clear enough. A cripple couldn't afford the luxury of sentiment. Clara's wedding ring twisted around her finger as she looked between the papers and her husband's face. Jed could see the war playing out behind her eyes, duty against desire, love against the grinding reality of their circumstances. "How did you know about us?" Jed asked suddenly, the question sharp enough to cut through Blackwood's practiced sales pitch. "How did you know about my condition, about our financial situation?" For the first time, Blackwood hesitated. His fingers drummed against his thigh again, and his gaze flicked toward Clara for just an instant before returning to Jed's face. It was barely perceptible, but Jed caught it, the quick glance that spoke of prior conversation, of information shared in confidence. "Word travels in small communities," Blackwood said finally. "Your accident was unfortunate but not exactly secret. A man of business learns to stay informed about opportunities." Doc Peterson cleared his throat uncomfortably, his weathered face troubled. "Jed, Clara, this is a big decision. Maybe you folks need some time to talk it over private-like." "No need," Blackwood said quickly, too quickly. "I'm afraid my offer has a time limit. Other properties to consider, other opportunities to pursue. I need an answer today, or I'll have to move on to more willing sellers." The pressure tactic was as obvious as fresh snow on a mountainside, but Jed could see it working on Clara. Her breathing had quickened, and she was twisting her wedding ring faster now, the gold band catching the light like a signal fire. Duke suddenly stood, his ears pointed toward the window. Through the glass, Jed could see the storm clouds massing over Devil's Backbone, dark and heavy with the promise of hard weather. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by thunder that rolled across the valley like the footsteps of giants. "Storm's coming fast," Clara said, her voice tight with more than concern about the weather. "Mr. Blackwood, you'd best not try to make it back to town in this blow. Doc Peterson knows these mountains well enough to find shelter, but a storm like this one can kill a man who doesn't respect it." Blackwood glanced toward the window, and Jed saw uncertainty flicker across his features. City men always underestimated mountain weather, thinking they could outwait or outrun forces that could bury a man in minutes. "There's a line shack about 2 miles south," Doc Peterson offered. "Used to be part of the Johnsons' spread before they sold out last spring. It's got a good roof and enough firewood to last the night. I'll guide you there, Clara said, rising from her chair with sudden decision. Can't have a visitor freezing to death on our property. She moved toward the coat pegs with quick, determined steps, and Jed felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Clara was volunteering to spend time alone with Blackwood, time away from the cabin and from Jed's watchful eyes. "That's not necessary," Jed said, his voice carrying a note of command that made Duke's tail wag once. "Mr. Blackwood can follow Doc Peterson's directions well enough." "Nonsense," Clara replied without, looking at him, pulling on her heaviest coat. "These trails can be tricky in bad weather, especially for someone who doesn't know them. I'll see him settled safe, then come straight back." She was already moving toward the door, Blackwood gathering his papers and following like a man who'd expected this very opportunity. Doc Peterson looked between them all with growing confusion, clearly sensing undercurrents he couldn't quite identify. "Clara," Jed said, and this time there was no mistaking the warning in his voice. She paused at the door, her hand on the latch, and turned to look at him. For a moment her mask slipped, and Jed saw something in her green eyes that made his blood turn cold, not guilt or shame, but a kind of desperate determination, like a cornered animal preparing to fight its way to freedom. "I'll be back before full dark," she said, her voice soft but final. "Keep Duke inside so he doesn't follow and get lost in the storm." Then she was gone, stepping out into Newling, the wind with Blackwood close behind her. Jed heard their voices on the porch, words lost in the rising howl of the approaching storm, then the sound of horses moving away down the mountain trail. Duke whined and pressed closer to the wheelchair, and Jed reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears with fingers that trembled slightly. Through the window, he watched Clara's figure disappear into the growing darkness, leading a stranger toward shelter while lightning split the sky overhead. Doc Peterson remained in his chair, coffee growing cold in his hands, his weathered face troubled. "Jed, that was mighty strange business. $50,000 is a powerful lot of money, but that man wasn't telling the whole truth about his reasons." Jed nodded, his eyes still fixed on the window where Clara had vanished. "No, he wasn't. Question is, what truth was he telling, and to whom?" Outside, the storm broke over the mountains with the fury of God's own judgment, rain lashing against the cabin walls and thunder shaking the very foundations of the earth. But inside, surrounded by the familiar comfort of his grandfather's handiwork, Jed felt something far more dangerous than weather beginning to tear at the foundations of everything he'd thought he knew about his life. The wedding ring Clara had left on the kitchen table caught the lightning's glare, gleaming like a promise broken or a trap about to spring. The storm raged through the night like a living thing, battering the cabin with wind and rain that spoke of winter's early approach. Jed sat by the window, Duke pressed against his wheelchair, both of them watching the trail where Clara had disappeared hours ago. Doc Peterson had dozed off in the chair by the fire, his medical bag at his feet and his breathing steady with the exhaustion of a man who'd seen too many long nights tending to others' troubles. Lightning illuminated the mountainside in stark, brief moments that revealed trees bent nearly horizontal. By the wind and water running down the slopes like rivers of silver, each flash made Jed's heart clench with worry and something deeper, a gnawing suspicion that grew stronger with every passing hour. Clara's abandoned wedding ring lay on the kitchen table where she'd left it, catching the firelight like an accusation. She'd never taken it off before, not in all their years together. Even when her hands swelled from the cold, or when she was kneading bread, she'd found ways to keep the simple gold band on her finger. For her to leave it behind felt deliberate, final, like a message he wasn't ready to understand. Duke whined softly and pushed his muzzle against Jed's hand, seeking comfort or offering it. The dog's instincts had been sharp about Blackwood, and now his restlessness spoke of dangers that went beyond the storm. Animals knew things, felt the currents of betrayal and deception that humans tried to hide beneath words and manners. Around midnight, the rain began to ease, though the wind still howled through the peaks like the voices of the dead. Jed strained his ears for any sound of approaching horses, any sign that Clara was making her way home through the treacherous darkness. But the night remained empty, except for the storm's fury. "She should have been back by now," he said quietly, not wanting to wake Doc Peterson but needing to voice his growing fear. The old doctor stirred anyway, his experienced ears attuned to the sound of worry in a man's voice. "Storm like this. Might have decided to wait it out at the line shack. Wouldn't be safe to travel these trails in the dark with wind like that." It was a reasonable explanation, the kind of practical decision Clara would make under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and the way she'd looked at him before leaving, that desperate, cornered expression, suggested decisions driven by something other than weather concerns. "Doc," Jed said after a long moment, "when you brought Blackwood up here, did he say anything about how he knew our situation? About who might have told him we'd be open to selling?" Peterson rubbed his beard thoughtfully, his weathered face troubled in the firelight. "Come to think of it, he did seem mighty well informed. Knew about your accident, knew Clara was working at Henderson's store, even knew about your money troubles. Said he'd been asking around town, but folks in Millfield don't generally gossip about their neighbors to strangers." The words confirmed what Jed had already suspected but hoped was wrong. Someone had been feeding Blackwood information, someone with intimate knowledge of their circumstances. The list of people who knew the details of their financial situation was short, and Clara's name sat at the top of it. Duke suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked toward the door. For a moment, hope flared in Jed's chest, but the sound that came through the storm wasn't hoofbeats. It was something else, a rhythmic tapping that seemed deliberate, purposeful. Peterson was on his feet immediately, moving toward the door with the caution of a man who'd lived long enough to know that unexpected visitors in the middle of stormy nights rarely brought good news. The tapping came again, 3 quick raps, followed by 2 longer ones. "That's a signal," Peterson said quietly, his hand hovering over the door latch. "Question is, from who?" The pattern repeated 3 quick, 2 slow. Jed recognized it now, a code he'd taught Clara years ago for identifying herself when returning from night hunting or supply runs. But if Clara was using the signal, why wasn't she simply calling out? And where was her horse? "Open it," Jed said, wheeling his chair closer. "But careful like." Peterson lifted the latch and pulled the door open slowly, ready to slam it shut again if necessary. Standing on the porch was a figure wrapped in a rain-soaked coat, face hidden beneath a dripping hat brim. For a moment, Jed's heart leaped, thinking Clara had returned on foot after some mishap with her horse. Then the figure raised its head, and Jed found himself looking at a stranger, a young man with dark eyes and the kind of lean build that spoke of hard living and harder choices. He was maybe 25, with a scraggly beard and clothes that had seen better days. Most telling of all, he wore a gun belt low on his hip, the leather worn smooth by constant use. "Mr. Cain?" the stranger said, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been Mexican or Indian. "My name's Miguel Santos. Mrs. Cain sent me to fetch you." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. Clara had sent this armed stranger to fetch him in the middle of a storm? Nothing about that made sense unless something had gone seriously wrong, or unless the situation was more complicated than a simple business transaction. "Where is she?" Jed demanded, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair hard enough to make his knuckles white. Santos glanced past him into the cabin, taking note of Doc Peterson's presence and Duke's low growl. "There's been some trouble at the line shack. Nothing dangerous, but she needs you there. Asked me to bring your wheelchair and help you down the trail." It was plausible enough. Storms could bring down trees or cause rock slides that would trap travelers in remote shelters. But everything about Santos set off alarm bells in Jed's mind. The man's eyes were too watchful, too calculating. His gun hand stayed relaxed but ready. Most damning of all, he'd somehow navigated mountain trails in a raging storm to reach their cabin, something that required either extraordinary skill or intimate knowledge of the area. "How do you know these mountains well enough to travel them in weather like this?" Jed asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Santos smiled, the expression not reaching his dark eyes. "I get around. Mrs. Cain was real insistent that I bring you quick as possible. Said to tell you she needs to talk about that business proposition." The mention of Blackwood's offer sent ice through Jed's veins. If Clara was discussing their private affairs with armed strangers, the situation had moved far beyond a simple land sale. She was either in serious danger or she was part of something that put him in danger. Duke's growl deepened, and the dog moved to position himself between Jed's wheelchair and the stranger. The animal's instincts were screaming warnings that Jed felt in his own gut. "I'm not going anywhere in this storm," Jed said firmly. "And I'm not leaving my dog behind." Santos shrugged, as if he'd expected that response. "Your choice, Mr. Cain. But Mrs. Cain was real clear about wanting to see you tonight, said to tell you that time's running out for making decisions." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Time was running out for what? For accepting Blackwood's offer? For keeping their land? Or for something else entirely, something that required Clara to send armed men through storms to collect her disabled husband? Outside, lightning flashed again, illuminating Santos's face in stark detail. For just an instant, Jed saw something there that made his blood run cold, not concern for Clara's welfare, but the patient satisfaction of a predator closing in on wounded prey. Doc Peterson stepped forward, his bulk filling the doorway as he studied Santos with the careful eye of a man who'd spent decades distinguishing between honest folk and those who meant harm. "Son, I've been doctoring in these mountains for 30 years, and I don't recall seeing you around Millfield before tonight." Santos's smile never wavered, but his hand shifted slightly, fingers moving closer to his gun belt. "Like I said, I get around. Lots of places in these mountains where a man can make a living without troubling the good folks in town." The implication was clear enough. Santos lived outside the law, in the hidden valleys and forgotten mining, camps where men asked few questions about each other's pasts. It explained his ability to navigate the storm-lashed trails and his casual familiarity with violence, but it raised deeper questions about how Clara had come to know such a man. "My wife doesn't associate with outlaws," Jed said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wondered if they were still true. "Times change, Mr. Cain," Santos replied, rainwater still dripping from his hat brim. "Folks do what they must to survive. Your lady understands that better than most." The casual way he referred to Clara as "your lady" sent fresh anger through Jed's chest. There was an intimacy in the phrase that spoke of conversations, of shared confidences, of a relationship that went beyond a chance meeting during a storm. Duke's growl deepened to a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The German shepherd had positioned himself directly between Jed's wheelchair and the door, hackles raised and amber eyes fixed on Santos with the unwavering focus of a predator recognizing another predator. "Easy, boy," Jed said quietly, though he made no move to call the dog off. Duke's instincts had never led him wrong, and right now they were screaming that Santos represented a threat that went far beyond simple rudeness. Santos glanced at the dog with the kind of calculation that made Jed's skin crawl. Big animal. Shame if something happened to him on the trail tonight. These storms can be dangerous for folks who don't know how to handle themselves. It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't far from one either. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a green wood fire. Accept Santos's invitation willingly or face the consequences of refusal. "Mr. Santos," Doc Peterson said, his voice carrying the authority of age and position, "I think you'd best state your business plain and simple. No more dancing around with hints and suggestions." Santos studied the older man for a long moment, weighing options with the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to violence. Finally, he reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, rain-spotted but still readable. "Mrs. Cain asked me to give you this if you proved stubborn about coming," he said, extending the paper toward Jed. "Said it might change your mind about the urgency of the situation." Jed took the paper with hands that trembled slightly from cold, he told himself, though he knew fear was just as likely. The handwriting was definitely Clara's, the familiar loops and curves he'd seen on shopping lists and letters for years. Asterisk Jed, asterisk the note read, asterisk I'm sorry it has to be this way, but I can't live like this anymore. The offer is real, and it's our only chance at a decent life. Miguel will bring you to me so we can discuss terms properly. Trust him, he's been helping me arrange things. We both know you can't take care of the land anymore, and I can't take care of you. This is our way out. Clara. Asterisk. The words hit him like physical blows, each line stripping away another piece of the life he'd thought he understood. Clara's careful handwriting made it official. She wanted out of their marriage, out of their mountain home, out of the life they'd built together. But it was the phrase, "He's been helping me arrange things," that cut deepest. Miguel Santos hadn't appeared tonight by chance, or even by Clara's sudden request. He'd been part of whatever was happening for some time, working with Clara, to arrange things in ways that excluded and betrayed her disabled husband. "She's been planning this," Jed said quietly, the words barely audible over the storm's continuing fury. Doc Peterson moved closer, reading the note over Jed's shoulder. His weathered face darkened with anger as he absorbed Clara's words. "This is wrong, Jed. Whatever trouble you two are having, this isn't the way to handle it. A wife doesn't send armed strangers to collect her husband in the middle of a storm." Santos shrugged, seemingly unbothered by the doctor's disapproval. "Mrs. Cain is a practical woman. She sees the situation for what it is, and she's taking steps to improve it. Can't fault a lady for looking out for her own interests." The casual dismissal of marriage vows and loyalty sparked something fierce in Jed's chest. Her interests? What about her husband's interests? What about the promises she made? "Promises made to a whole man," Santos replied with brutal honesty. "Things change when circumstances change. Your lady sees that, even if you don't." Duke's growl turned into a snarl, and the dog took a step forward. Santos's hand dropped to his gun, movement smooth and practiced. The threat of violence hung in the cabin air like the scent of gunpowder. "Call off your dog, Mr. Cain," Santos said, his voice soft but deadly serious. "I'd hate for things to turn unpleasant when we're all just trying to help Mrs. Cain resolve this situation peacefully." Jed recognized the moment for what it was, a crossroads where his next decision would shape everything that followed. He could comply, follow Santos into the storm and whatever trap awaited him at the line shack. Or he could resist, defend his home and his dignity, and face whatever consequences Santos and his unknown allies chose to deliver. Outside, the wind howled through the peaks like the voices of all the mountain men who'd lived and died in these hills before him. Their ghosts seemed to whisper warnings about trusting strangers and the price of surrendering without a fight. Clara's wedding ring still lay on the kitchen table, catching the firelight like a golden accusation. She'd left it behind deliberately, Jed realized now, not as an oversight, but as a symbol. She was shedding her old life like a snake shedding its skin, and Jed was just another piece of the past she was ready to discard. The realization brought with it a cold clarity that cut through his hurt and confusion. If Clara had chosen betrayal, if she was working with men like Santos to strip him of everything he'd held dear, then the woman he'd married was already gone. What remained was the question of whether Jed Cain would go quietly into whatever darkness they'd prepared for him, or whether some of the old mountain man's fighting spirit still lived in his broken body. The silence stretched like a bowstring, tension thick enough to cut with a blade. Jed's hands rested on the wheels of his chair, feeling the familiar texture of wood and metal that had become both his prison and his throne. Duke remained coiled beside him, every muscle ready for violence, while Doc Peterson's breathing had grown shallow with the kind of fear that came from recognizing a situation sliding beyond control. Santos waited with the patience of a man accustomed to getting his way, whether through persuasion or force. His dark eyes never left Jed's face, reading the internal struggle with the cold assessment of a predator watching. Wounded prey decide whether to run or fight. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Mr. Cain?" Santos said finally, his voice carrying a false sympathy that made Jed's teeth clench. "Your lady tried to do this the easy way. Blackwood's offer was genuine, $50,000, clean and simple. All you had to do was sign the papers and take the money. But you had to be stubborn, had to cling to sentiment and pride." The words confirmed what Jed had already suspected but hoped wasn't true. Clara had been working with these people from the beginning, setting up the land sale, arranging for Blackwood's visit, probably feeding him information about their circumstances for weeks or months. "How long?" Jed asked quietly. "How long has she been planning this?" Santos smiled, the expression carrying no warmth. "Long enough to know every detail of your finances, your habits, your weaknesses. Long enough to understand that a man in your condition doesn't have many options when people start applying pressure." Doc Peterson shifted uncomfortably, his medical bag clutched in weathered hands. "This is conspiracy, son. What you're describing is fraud and coercion. A woman can't just sell her husband's property without his consent, no matter what difficulties they're facing. Can't she?" Santos replied with amusement. "Depends on how the paperwork is arranged. Depends on whether the husband is in any condition to contest the sale. Lot of ways to handle situations like this when you know the right people and have the right documentation." The implication was clear and chilling. They weren't just planning to pressure Jed into selling, they were prepared to forge his signature, declare him mentally incompetent, or simply eliminate him as an obstacle to their plans. Clara's betrayal ran deeper than simple greed or desperation. She was part of a criminal conspiracy that viewed her husband as nothing more than a problem to be solved. Duke's snarl deepened, and the dog took another step toward Santos, sensing the threat even if he couldn't understand the words. The German shepherd's loyalty had never wavered, not through the darkest days of Jed's recovery, not through the long months of helplessness and despair. Unlike humans, dogs understood that devotion meant standing by those you loved when they needed you most. "Call off your animal, Mr. Cain," Santos said, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt. "I'm trying to handle this civilized-like, but my patience has limits." "So does mine," Jed replied, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "You want me to come with you? Make your case. Explain why I should trust a man who threatens my dog and talks about forging legal documents." Santos studied him for a long moment, reassessing. "You're not as broken as your lady made you sound." "Good. Makes this more interesting." He reached into his coat again, this time producing a different piece of paper, older, more worn, with official seals, and signatures that made Jed's blood turn cold. It was a death certificate, dated 3 days in the future, bearing Jed's name and listing cause of death as accidental fall during storm. "Your wife's been thorough," Santos said, enjoying the shock on Jed's face. "Doc Peterson here will be the attending physician, of course. Tragic accident during a rescue attempt. Poor paralyzed man tried to help his wife when she got trapped by a rock slide, lost his balance, fell to his death. Very sad, very believable." Doc Peterson's face had gone white as fresh snow. I would never sign such a thing. This is murder you're talking about, not some business arrangement." "You'll sign it," Santos said with casual confidence. "Because if you don't, we'll just have to arrange a second accident. Old doctor gets lost in the storm trying to help neighbors, never found. These things happen in the mountains." The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in like the sides of a trap. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the peaks, wind and rain battering everything in their path. Inside, Jed found himself facing the reality that Clara's betrayal was more complete and vicious than he'd imagined possible. But something else was stirring in his chest, something he hadn't felt since before his accident. It was anger, pure and clean and hot as forge fire. For 3 years he'd felt sorry for himself, wallowing in self-pity and helplessness. He'd accepted charity, endured Clara's growing coldness, allowed himself to become a burden rather than a man. Now, facing the ultimate betrayal, he remembered who he'd been before the accident. Jedidiah Cain hadn't built a life in these mountains by giving up when things got difficult. He'd survived blizzards that killed lesser men, fought off wolves and bears, carved a living from stone and timber through sheer stubborn will. A broken spine hadn't changed the core of who he was. It had just made him forget for a while. "You made one mistake," Jed said quietly, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair with renewed strength. "What's that?" Santos asked, amused. "You assumed that being paralyzed meant being helpless." Duke sensed the change in his master's tone and moved closer, hackles still raised, but ready now for whatever command might come. Doc Peterson looked between them with growing understanding, recognizing that the broken man in the wheelchair was finding his fighting spirit again. Santos's amusement faded as he registered the shift in Jed's demeanor. "Mr. Cain, I think you're forgetting your situation. You're a cripple in a wheelchair, miles from help, with your wife already turned against you. What exactly do you think you can do?" Jed's smile was cold as winter wind. "Let's find out." The wooden artifact Clara had carved for him years ago, a small mountain lion that sat on the mantel, seemed to watch the confrontation with amber eyes that matched Duke's. She'd given it to him during their first winter together, saying it reminded her of his quiet strength and patient determination. Now it served as a reminder of what she'd once valued in him and what she'd chosen to throw away. But strength and determination weren't things that could be paralyzed or bought or betrayed. They lived deeper than broken bones, in the part of a man that chose to fight even when fighting seemed impossible. The transformation in Jed's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, the straightening of his shoulders, the way his hands shifted on the wheelchair's arms, the cold calculation that replaced despair in his eyes. Duke sensed it immediately, his snarling quieting to an alert readiness that spoke of a pack preparing for battle rather than cowering from predators. Santos noticed the change too, his casual confidence wavering as he reassessed the man he'd dismissed as helpless. "Mr. Cain, I'm trying to give you a chance to handle this with dignity. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Dignity?" Jed's voice carried the weight of winter storms and granite peaks. "You want to talk about dignity while you wave around forged death certificates and threaten an old man who's spent his life helping people?" Doc Peterson straightened beside him, fear giving way to the righteous anger of a man who devoted decades to preserving life, only to be threatened by those who dealt in death. "Jed's right. I've delivered babies and set bones and sat with the dying for 30 years in these mountains. I'll be damned if I let some outlaw and a faithless woman turn me into their accomplice." Santos's hand tightened on his gun, but he hadn't drawn it yet. Professional killers preferred to avoid unnecessary noise when possible, and a gunshot in a mountain cabin during a storm would echo for miles. But Jed could see the man's patience wearing thin, the careful facade of civilized conversation cracking to reveal the violence underneath. "The thing is," Jed continued, his voice conversational despite the deadly tension in the room, "you and Clara made this plan, thinking I was the same broken man who's been sitting in this chair, feeling sorry for himself for 3 years. But you've reminded me of something important." "What's that?" Santos asked, though his tone suggested he was growing tired of conversation. "That I'm still alive. And as long as I'm breathing, I'm dangerous." The wooden mountain lion on the mantel seemed to watch the confrontation with approval, its carved amber eyes reflecting the firelight like living flames. Clara had spent hours working on that piece, carefully shaping each muscle and whisker during the long evenings of their first winter together. She'd said it captured something essential about Jed, his patience, his strength, his ability to survive in conditions that would break other men. Now, that same patience and strength were focusing on the immediate problem of staying alive long enough to turn the tables on his would-be killers. 3 years of helplessness had taught him to think differently, to see angles and opportunities that a mobile man might miss. When you couldn't run or fight in conventional ways, you learned to use your mind as a weapon. "Duke," Jed said quietly, not taking his eyes off Santos. "Remember what we practiced." The German shepherd's ears pricked forward, and his tail gave a single sharp wag. During the long months of recovery, Jed had trained the dog in various commands and signals, partly for practical reasons and partly to give them both something to focus on besides his limitations. Some of those commands had been designed for hunting, others for protection, and a few for situations exactly like this one. Santos glanced at the dog with growing unease. Duke was a large animal, well-muscled and clearly intelligent, with the kind of loyalty that made him willing to die for his master. Even armed, Santos would have difficulty dealing with a coordinated attack from both man and dog in the confined space of the cabin. "You're bluffing," Santos said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "A paralyzed man and an old dog against someone who's killed more men than you've probably met in your lifetime." "Maybe," Jed acknowledged. "But here's what you're forgetting, Mr. Santos. This is my home. I know every board, every nail, every hiding place my grandfather built into these walls. I know which floorboards creak and which ones are solid. I know where he hid things, and I know what he hid." He was thinking of the old flintlock rifle concealed behind a false panel near the fireplace, loaded and primed despite its age. His grandfather had been a cautious man who believed in being prepared for trouble, whether it came in the form of bears, bandits, or government men with too many questions about a mountain man's business. Santos's eyes narrowed as he tried to determine if Jed was bluffing or if there really were weapons hidden within reach. The uncertainty was exactly what Jed wanted. Doubt was the enemy of quick, decisive action, and doubt could buy time for better opportunities. "Even if you're armed," Santos said, "you're still outnumbered. I'm not working alone, Mr. Cain. Mrs. Cain and Mr. Time Blackwood are waiting at the line shack with others who share our professional interests. You kill me, and they'll know something went wrong. They'll come here, and they'll finish what I started." The revelation that more killers were involved wasn't entirely surprising, but it confirmed that Clara's betrayal was part of a larger conspiracy. Blackwood wasn't just a land buyer, he was part of whatever criminal enterprise had set its sights on their property. The question was whether they wanted the land for its mineral rights, its strategic location, or simply as part of some larger scheme that required clearing out inconvenient residents. "How many?" Doc Peterson asked, his medical training making him think in terms of treating multiple wounds if shooting started. "Enough," Santos replied with renewed confidence. "More than enough to handle a crippled mountain man and his dog, no matter how clever he thinks he's being." But Jed was studying Santos's face, reading the subtle tells that revealed more than words. The man was worried about something, not about Jed's immediate threat, but about his own situation if things went wrong. There were tensions in the criminal partnership, disagreements about methods or payment that made Santos vulnerable to pressure from his own allies. "Clara promised you something, didn't she?" Jed said, the pieces falling into place. "Not just money from the land sale, but something more personal. Problem is, you're starting to realize that a woman who'd betray her husband might not be entirely trustworthy when it comes to keeping promises to her accomplices." Santos's expression flickered just for an instant, but long enough to confirm Jed's suspicion. Clara had made Santos promises she didn't intend to keep or couldn't keep, and the killer was beginning to understand that he might be as expendable as anyone else in this conspiracy. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, the wind's howl fading to a mournful whisper through the peaks. Soon the weather would clear enough for travel, and Santos's allies would expect him to return with either Jed's cooperation or confirmation of his death. Time was running out, and everyone in the cabin knew it. The sound that broke the tense silence wasn't what anyone expected. It was the soft whistle of a bird call, 3 notes rising and falling like a mountain meadowlark song. Santos's head snapped toward the window, his face suddenly tight with alarm rather than confidence. "That's not right," he muttered, hand moving to his gun. They weren't supposed to signal until... The call came again, more urgent this time, and Santos moved toward the window with the quick, nervous steps of a man whose, carefully laid, plans were going wrong. Through the rain-streaked glass, Jed could see a figure on horseback, silhouetted against the lightning, too distant to make out details, but close enough to represent either rescue or additional threat. "Who is that?" Doc Peterson whispered, moving closer to Jed's chair. Santos peered through the storm, his earlier cockiness replaced by genuine worry. "Could be Blackwood, but the signal's wrong. We agreed on different calls for different situations, and this one means trouble." Duke's ears had pricked forward at the whistle, and something in his body language suggested recognition rather than alarm. The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, as if he'd caught a familiar scent on the wind despite the rain and distance. The horseman was approaching steadily through the storm, and as lightning flickered across the mountainside, Jed caught a glimpse of something that made his heart skip. The rider sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle, and there was something about his size and bearing that struck a chord of memory. "Miguel," a voice called from outside, barely audible over the wind, but carrying clearly enough to make Santos curse under his breath. "We've got problems. The whole operation's blown." Santos looked between Jed and the door, clearly torn between maintaining control of his prisoners and responding to his allies' warning. The voice outside was American, not Mexican like Blackwood, with the rough accent of someone who'd spent time in mining camps and cattle drives. "Stay where you are," Santos ordered, drawing his gun at last. "Nobody moves until I figure out what's happening." But Jed was studying the approaching rider more carefully, using every flash of lightning to piece together details that made his pulse quicken with something that might have been hope. The horse was a paint black and white patches that looked familiar even through the storm. The rider wore a hat pulled low against the weather, but his size and the way he carried himself sparked memories that Jed had tried to bury along with so much else from his past. The man outside called again. Closer now. "Miguel, Blackwood's dead, and Clara's run off with the money. We need to get out of here before the law shows up." Santos's face went white as the implications hit him. His carefully planned conspiracy was collapsing. His allies were dead or fled, and he was alone in a mountain cabin with witnesses who could identify him. All his leverage had just evaporated like morning mist. "That's impossible," he said, though his voice carried the hollow ring of a man trying to convince himself. Clara would do exactly what serves Clara's interests," Jed said quietly, "just like she did with me, just like she did with you. The only difference is that you trusted her with your life, and she's already proven how much that trust is worth." The rider was close enough now that Duke had risen to his feet, tail wagging with genuine excitement. Through the storm and the years, the dog had recognized someone who'd been important in their past, someone Jed himself was beginning to hope might be exactly who he appeared to be. 3 sharp knocks came at the door, followed by a voice that made Jed's breath catch in his throat. "Jed? You in there, brother?" "It's Tommy, Thomas Cain, Jed's younger brother, who'd left the mountains 5 years ago to try his luck in the Colorado goldfields. Tommy, who'd sworn he'd come back if Jed ever needed him, who'd sent letters faithfully until the accident made Jed too proud and bitter to answer them." Santos spun toward the door, gun raised and finger on the trigger. "I don't know who that is, but if he comes through that door, he's a dead man." "He's my brother," Jed said, and for the first time in hours, he smiled. "And if I know Tommy, he didn't come alone." As if summoned by his words, more voices called out from the darkness. Around the cabin, men positioning themselves at strategic points, cutting off escape routes, surrounding the building with the methodical precision of experienced fighters. "This is Sheriff Morrison from Millfield," another voice called. "The cabin's surrounded. Anyone inside needs to come out with their hands visible." Santos's confident expression crumbled completely as he realized his situation had reversed in a matter of minutes. He was trapped in an isolated cabin with armed lawmen outside and witnesses inside, his escape routes cut off, and his criminal partners either dead or fled. "How?" he demanded, swinging the gun between Jed and Doc Peterson as if one of them had somehow summoned help through supernatural means. "Tommy always was the smart one in the family," Jed said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man watching justice arrive at exactly the right moment. "When I stopped answering his letters, he got worried. Started asking around, checking up on me through other folks. Doc Peterson here has been writing to him regularly, letting him know how bad things had gotten." Doc Peterson nodded, a smile creasing his weathered face. "Figured you were too proud to ask for help, but that didn't mean help shouldn't be available. Tommy's been keeping tabs on the situation, and when I sent word about Blackwood's visit and Clara's strange behavior, he decided it was time to come home." "But how did they know to come tonight?" Santos demanded, desperation replacing his earlier confidence. "Because," came Tommy's voice from just outside the door, "we've been watching Clara for weeks, followed her and her fancy city friends to their meetings, listened to their plans, documented their conspiracy. When the storm started and she led Blackwood to that line shack, we knew tonight was when they'd make their move." The truth hit Santos like a physical blow. While he'd been planning Jed's murder, Tommy and the sheriff had been building a case against the entire conspiracy. Clara's betrayal had been observed and documented, Blackwood's criminal connections had been investigated, and the whole elaborate scheme had been unraveling, even as Santos thought he was closing the trap. "Miguel Santos," Sheriff Morrison called, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and attempted extortion. Send out your weapon and come out peaceful-like, and nobody has to get hurt." Santos looked around the cabin with the wild eyes of a cornered animal, seeing no escape and no allies. His grand conspiracy had collapsed, his partners were dead or fled, and he faced either capture or a shootout he couldn't win. But Jed was watching something else. Duke's behavior as the dog pressed against the door, whining with excitement at the prospect of seeing Tommy again. The German shepherd remembered the young man who'd helped train him as a puppy, who'd taken him hunting in the high meadows, who'd treated him with the casual affection of family. Family. The word carried new meaning as Jed realized that while Clara had abandoned him, his real family, his brother, and the friends who truly cared about his welfare had never stopped watching out for him. His isolation had been as much self-imposed as circumstantial, built from pride and despair rather than actual abandonment. The wooden mountain lion on the mantel seemed to nod in approval, its carved features catching the firelight like a blessing from the spirits of all the mountain men who'd faced down trouble in these hills before him. Santos backed toward the cabin's far wall, his gun wavering between Jed and Doc Peterson as the reality of his situation crystallized into desperate calculation. Outside, the voices of lawmen coordinating their positions carried clearly through the storm, each call-out marking another escape route sealed off, another option eliminated. "This isn't over," Santos snarled, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cabin's chill. "You think your brother and some small-town sheriff can protect you? The people I work for don't give up easy, and they don't forget." Jed studied the man's face, reading the mixture of rage and fear that twisted his features. Santos was dangerous precisely because he was cornered a wounded animal with nothing left to lose. But there was something else in his expression, a flicker of calculation that suggested he wasn't ready to surrender, despite the hopelessness of his position. "Miguel!" Tommy's voice called from outside, closer now. "Last chance to end this peaceful. Throw out your weapon and come out with your hands where we can see them." Santos's response was a bitter laugh that held no humor. Your brother thinks this is about land and money. He has no idea what's really at stake here, what forces he's interfering with. Enlighten us, Jed said, keeping his voice steady despite the gun pointed in his direction. Duke remained pressed against his chair, muscles coiled and ready, amber eyes tracking Santos's every movement. This valley sits on the richest silver vein in Montana, Santos said, his voice taking on the fervor of a man sharing a dangerous secret. Not just your 800 acres, but the whole basin. Enough silver to build railroads, fund armies, change the balance of power in territories that aren't even states yet. Doc Peterson shifted uncomfortably, understanding dawning in his weathered features. That's why Blackwood was so eager to buy, why the offer was so generous. They weren't after Jed's land specifically, they were trying to control the entire valley. Smart old man, Santos acknowledged. Blackwood represented interests in Denver and San Francisco, men with enough money and influence to make problems disappear when necessary. Your little homestead was just the first piece in a much larger puzzle. The revelation explained much the elaborate conspiracy, the willingness to commit murder for what seemed like a modest land grab, the professional killers brought in to handle what should have been a simple business transaction. Jed's property wasn't valuable for its own sake, but as part of a mining operation that could generate fortunes. Clara knew, Jed said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. She knew about the silver, about the larger plan. That's why she was so eager to sell, why she was willing to betray her own husband. Santos nodded, his gun still trained on them, but his attention partly focused on the sounds outside. Smart woman, your wife, smarter than Blackwood anyway. He thought he could control her, use her, and dispose of her when she was no longer useful. Instead, she used him. The confirmation of Clara's calculating betrayal hit Jed like a physical blow, but it also brought with it a strange sense of relief. The woman he'd mourned, the wife he'd thought he'd lost to circumstance and hardship, had never really existed. She'd been playing a role, waiting for the right opportunity to cash in her performance for real money. Where is she now? Doc Peterson asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Gone, Santos said with grudging admiration. Took the advance money Blackwood had brought for land purchases, over 100,000 in cash and bank drafts, and disappeared into the storm. By the time anyone realizes she's not coming back, she'll be on a train to San Francisco or Chicago, with a new name and enough money to buy herself a whole new life. Thunder rolled across the mountains, but it was distant now, the storm moving eastward toward the plains. The clearing weather would make travel easier, but it also meant Santos's window for escape was shrinking. Soon the trails would be passable for determined lawmen, and the remote valley would no longer provide the isolation criminals needed for their work. The thing is, Santos continued, his voice taking on a manic edge, Clara made one mistake, she thought. Killing Blackwood would end the operation, that the money men in Denver would just write off their losses and move on to other opportunities. But men like that don't give up when they smell profits this large. What are you saying? Jed demanded, though a cold certainty was already forming in his mind. I'm saying this valley is going to be developed whether you cooperate or not, Santos replied. Legal or illegal, voluntary or forced, the silver's coming out of these mountains. The only question is whether you and your neighbors are still breathing when it happens. Duke's growl deepened as Santos shifted position, the dog sensing the mounting tension. Outside, the lawmen were growing impatient. Jed could hear Sheriff Morrison coordinating with his men, preparing for a forced entry if Santos didn't surrender soon. 10 minutes, came Tommy's voice from the porch. Then we're coming in, ready or not. Santos wiped sweat from his forehead with his free hand, leaving damp streaks across his skin. Your brother's brave, I'll give him that. But brave men die just as easy as cowards when they get in the way of serious money. The threat hung in the air like smoke, And Jed realized that Santos wasn't just planning to escape, he was planning to take hostages, to use the people Jed cared about as shields and bargaining chips. A cornered killer with nothing to lose was capable of devastating cruelty, especially when he felt betrayed by his own allies. "You're thinking of using us to get out of here," Jed said, reading the calculation in Santos's eyes. "Problem is, you're forgetting something important." "What's that?" "This is still my home, and mountain men don't give up their homes without a fight." Jed's hand moved slowly toward the hidden panel his grandfather had built beside the fireplace, fingers finding the concealed catch despite 3 years of disuse. The old flintlock rifle was where it had always been, loaded and primed according to mountain tradition, ready to defend hearth and family against whatever threats the wilderness might send. Santos caught the movement too late, his attention divided between the sounds outside and the conversation inside. By the time he swung his gun toward Jed, the hidden panel was already sliding open, revealing the ancient but functional weapon that had protected 3 generations of Cains. "Don't be stupid," Santos warned, but his voice carried more desperation than authority now. "That old gun probably hasn't been fired in decades. It's more likely to blow up in your face than stop me." "Maybe," Jed acknowledged, his hands steady as he lifted the flintlock from its hiding place. "But my grandfather always said a gun that's properly maintained will shoot true for 100 years. This one's only 80 years old." Doc Peterson moved closer to the window, positioning himself to signal the lawmen outside if shooting started. Duke remained at Jed's side, ready to attack on command. His loyalty unwavering despite the danger. The wooden mountain lion on the mantel seemed to watch the confrontation with approval, its carved features reflecting the firelight like living eyes. It had witnessed 3 generations of Cains defending their mountain home, had seen them face down bears and bandits, storms and starvation. Now it would witness whether the current generation still carried the courage of their ancestors. "You know what the real irony is?" Jed said, checking the flintlock's priming with movements made smooth by childhood practice. Clara thought she was getting rid of a broken man who couldn't protect what was his. Instead, she reminded me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems hopeless. Santos's gun hand was trembling slightly now, the weight of his weapon growing heavier as stress and adrenaline took their toll. He was a killer, but he was accustomed to having advantages, superior numbers, better weapons, helpless victims. Facing an armed opponent on equal terms was testing his nerve in ways he hadn't expected. "Last warning," came Tommy's voice from outside. "We're coming in." The sound of boots on the porch was unmistakable, followed by the creak of wood as multiple men positioned themselves around the cabin's entrances. Sheriff Morrison's voice carried the authority of law and justice, backed by the firepower of determined men who'd seen enough of criminal conspiracy in their peaceful valley. Santos looked between the flintlock in Jed's hands and the door where lawmen were preparing to enter, his calculation finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. But desperate men didn't always make rational choices, and Jed could see the moment when Santos decided to take as many enemies with him as possible rather than face capture and certain hanging. The next few seconds would determine whether justice prevailed or whether the mountain claimed more victims too, add to its long catalogue of violent deaths. The moment Santos's finger tightened on the trigger, Duke moved with the lightning reflexes that had served him through years of hunting and protection. The German shepherd launched himself across the cabin like a furry missile, amber eyes fixed on the gun hand that threatened his master. Santos's shot went wild as 80 pounds of snarling loyalty crashed into him, the bullet splintering wood above Jed's head instead of finding its intended target. The killer's curse was cut short as Duke's jaws clamped down on his wrist, powerful muscles designed for bringing down elk, now focused on disarming a murderer. The crash of the cabin door exploding inward came simultaneously with Santos's scream of pain and rage. Tommy Cain filled the doorway like an avenging angel, rifle raised and ready, his younger face carrying the same determined expression that had marked mountain men for generations. Behind him came Sheriff Morrison and two deputies, weapons drawn and spreading out to cover every angle of the small room. "Drop it!" Morrison bellowed, though Santos was already struggling to maintain his grip on the gun while Duke savaged his wrist. Blood ran down the killer's arm, staining his shirt and dripping onto the cabin floor that had known only honest work and family love until this night. Jed raised the flintlock with hands steadier than they'd been in 3 years, the familiar weight of his grandfather's weapon bringing back memories of childhood lessons and mountain wisdom. The old rifle might have been ancient, but it was loaded with enough powder and shot to end Santos's threat permanently if necessary. "Duke, hold!" Jed commanded, and the dog immediately shifted his grip, maintaining control of Santos's gun hand without continuing to tear flesh. Years of training and absolute trust between man and animal showed in the precision of Duke's response. He held the threat immobile without unnecessary brutality. Santos sagged against the cabin wall, his face white with shock and pain, the fight draining out of him as he realized his situation was hopeless. The gun fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the floor where Sheriff Morrison quickly kicked it away from his reach. Tommy crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his eyes taking in his brother's condition and the evidence of the night's violence. 3 years had changed him. The boy who'd left for the goldfields had returned as a man, broader in the shoulders and darker around the eyes, marked by experiences that had hardened him without destroying his essential decency. "Jed," Tommy said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm sorry I stayed away so long. I'm sorry I let you face this alone." "You came when it mattered," Jed replied, lowering the flintlock but keeping it within reach. "That's what counts." Sheriff Morrison was applying iron shackles to Santos's wrists, the metallic click final and unforgiving. "Miguel, Santos, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, fraud, extortion, and whatever other charges the prosecutor decides to add. You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you'll want to talk once you understand how much trouble you're in." Santos looked up at them with the defeated expression of a man who'd gambled everything on a single hand and lost. Blood still seeped from Duke's bite marks, but the wounds weren't severe. The dog had been trained to disable, not to kill unless absolutely necessary. "She played us all," Santos said finally, his voice hollow with exhaustion and betrayal. "Clara, your precious wife. She set this whole thing up from the beginning, used Blackwood's greed and my desperation to clear the field for herself. While we were planning to kill you for the land, she was planning to kill us for the money." The words confirmed what Jed had already suspected, but hearing them spoken aloud still carried the sting of ultimate betrayal. Clara hadn't been a victim of circumstances or gradual corruption. She'd been a predator from the start, patient and calculating, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. "Where do you think she's headed?" Tommy asked, holstering his rifle now that the immediate threat was contained. "Could be anywhere by now," Santos replied with bitter admiration. "She's smart enough to have planned escape routes, false identities, maybe even accomplices we never knew about. Woman like that doesn't put all her eggs in one basket." Doc Peterson was examining Santos's wounds with professional detachment, binding the worst of the bite marks with strips torn from a clean shirt. "These will heal fine, but you'll carry scars. Seems fitting, somehow." Duke remained alert beside Jed's wheelchair, his fur still slightly bristled from the confrontation, but his tail beginning a tentative wag now that his family was safe. The dog's amber eyes moved between Jed and Tommy, recognizing the bond between brothers and accepting the newcomer back into the pack. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind the clean, sharp smell of rain-washed air and the promise of clear skies. Through the cabin window, Jed could see stars beginning to appear between the breaking clouds, the same constellations that had watched over his grandfather and father, that had guided mountain men through countless dark nights in these peaks. The immediate crisis was over, but larger questions remained. Clara was still out there somewhere with stolen money and the knowledge to bring more trouble to the valley. The mining interests in Denver would eventually send other agents, other schemes, to separate honest folks from their land. The mountains held their silver still, waiting to be torn from the earth by men who saw only profit where generations had found home. As Sheriff Morrison led Santos away in shackles, Tommy knelt beside Jed's wheelchair, his weathered hands gripping the armrests with the fierce protectiveness of family finally reunited. The years had carved lines around his eyes and added silver to his dark hair, but his expression carried the same stubborn loyalty that had marked the Cain bloodline for generations. "We found Blackwood's body at the line shack," Tommy said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of ugly discoveries. "Shot twice in the back while he was counting out money. Clara left him there like discarded trash, took everything of value, and rode out into the storm like she had the devil himself chasing her." Jed absorbed the news without surprise, though it still twisted something cold and bitter in his chest. The woman who'd shared his bed and his dreams had become a killer as casually as she'd become a betrayer, shedding moral constraints along with her wedding vows. "How long have you been watching?" Jed asked, studying his brother's face for signs of the hardships that had aged him beyond his years. 3 months, Tommy replied. "Doc, Peterson sent word that something wasn't right up here, that Clara was acting strange and you'd stopped answering letters. I came back to find you thin as a rail and her meeting with strangers in town, having conversations that ended when honest folk got too close." Doc Peterson settled into his chair by the fire, his medical bag finally set aside now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Your brother's been staying with the widow Morrison, gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to act. We knew about the land scheme, but we didn't realize how deep the conspiracy ran until tonight. The revelation that people had been watching over him, protecting him even when he'd felt most abandoned, brought unexpected moisture to Jed's eyes. Pride and self-pity had blinded him to the loyalty that surrounded him, made him think his wheelchair meant he was truly alone in the world. "The silver's real," Tommy continued, pulling out a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of metal on metal. "I've been testing rock samples from all over the valley. There's enough precious ore in these mountains to make every family in 3 counties wealthy beyond their dreams." He poured a handful of raw silver nuggets into his palm, the metal gleaming in the firelight like captured starlight. The chunks were rough and unrefined, but their value was unmistakable enough to explain the elaborate conspiracy, the willingness to commit murder, the involvement of powerful interests from distant cities. "Clara knew," Jed said, the pieces of her betrayal forming a complete picture at last. "She knew about the silver, probably before I had my accident. Maybe that's why she stayed with me in the beginning, not from love or duty, but because she was waiting for the right opportunity to cash in." Tommy's jaw tightened with anger at the calculated nature of his sister-in-law's deception. "The Denver Syndicate has been buying up land all through the Rockies, looking for mineral deposits. They use people like Blackwood to make legitimate offers, and people like Santos when legitimate methods fail. Clara was supposed to be their local contact, someone who could provide information about property owners and their vulnerabilities." Duke pressed closer to Jed's wheelchair, sensing the emotional turmoil in his master's voice. The dog's unwavering presence served as a reminder that some loyalties couldn't be bought, couldn't be corrupted, couldn't be broken by circumstance or hardship. "What happens now?" Doc Peterson asked, voicing the question that hung over them all like the scent of approaching winter. "Now we fight," Tommy said simply. "The Denver Syndicate will send more agents, make new offers, try new schemes to separate us from our land, but they're not dealing with isolated homesteaders anymore. Word's already spreading to other valleys, other communities that need to know what they're up against." He reached into his coat and withdrew a thick folder, filled with documents, photographs, and correspondence. We've been building a case against the whole operation, names, dates, financial records, everything needed to expose their criminal methods. The territorial governor's already expressed interest in prosecuting mining fraud, especially when it involves murder and conspiracy. Jed studied the evidence his brother had gathered, recognizing the patient, methodical approach that had always marked Tommy's character. Where Jed had been the physical one, comfortable with axe and rifle, Tommy had been the thinker, comfortable with words and legal complexities. They killed the wrong man's husband, Jed said finally, running his fingers over the documents that would bring justice to Clara and her criminal partners. They picked the wrong valley to corrupt. The wooden mountain lion on the mantel seemed to nod in approval, its carved features reflecting the firelight like a blessing from the spirits of all the mountain men who'd defended their homes in these peaks. Clara had thrown away something precious, the love and protection of a man who would have died for her in exchange for blood money and a fugitive's life. But she'd also awakened something dangerous, the righteous anger of a mountain community that had learned to stand together against threats that no individual could face alone. The silver in the hills would be extracted eventually, but it would benefit the people who'd lived and died in these valleys, not distant speculators who saw only profit where others had built their lives. 6 months later, Jed sat on the porch of his grandfather's cabin, watching the morning sun paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose. The wheelchair remained, but it no longer felt like a prison. It was simply another tool, like an axe or a rifle, something that helped him accomplish what needed doing. Duke lay beside him, graying muzzle resting on crossed paws, amber eyes alert for the familiar sounds of Tommy. Returning from his morning ride through the valley, the wooden mountain lion had found a new place of honor on the porch rail, where it could watch over the land that 3 generations of Cains had called home. Clara's hurried carving had captured something essential about the mountain's patient strength, their ability to endure whatever storms life brought their way. It seemed fitting that her one honest creation should outlast all her deceptions. The sound of approaching hoofbeats brought both man and dog to attention, but these were familiar rhythms now, Tommy's paint horse and the steady clip-clop of Doc Peterson's old mare. The 2 men had become regular visitors, checking on Jed's welfare and sharing news from the wider valley, where their fight against the mining syndicate continued to unfold. "Morning, brother," Tommy called as he swung down from the saddle, his movements easy and confident despite the long hours he'd been spending in territorial courts and government offices. "Got news from Denver that you'll want to hear." Doc Peterson dismounted more carefully, his joints protesting the early morning ride, but his weathered face carried a satisfaction that spoke of good developments. He'd thrown himself into the fight against the conspiracy with the fierce dedication of a man who'd spent his life protecting people from those who would harm them. "Clara?" Jed asked, though he'd long since stopped hoping for resolution on that front. "Still in the wind," Tommy admitted, settling onto the porch steps with the easy familiarity of family. "But the money trail's getting warmer. Federal marshals traced some of Blackwood's stolen funds to banks in San Francisco and Chicago. Won't be long before her new identity starts showing cracks." It was better than nothing, though Jed had made his peace with the possibility that Clara might escape earthly justice entirely. Some betrayals were too deep for any court to address, requiring a different kind of resolution that came from within rather than from external punishment. "The syndicate's finished, though," Doc Peterson added with satisfaction, settling into the chair Jed kept ready for visitors. Tommy's evidence convinced the territorial governor to launch a full investigation. Turns out the Denver group was running similar schemes all through Colorado and Montana, using murder and fraud when legitimate business failed them. 17 indictments so far, Tommy said, pulling out a newspaper from his coat, including some very prominent businessmen who thought their money and connections would protect them from the consequences of hiring killers. The headlines spoke of justice finally served, of a conspiracy broken, and its leaders facing federal charges that would put them behind bars for the rest of their natural lives. It was more resolution than Jed had dared hope for when Santos first appeared at his door with threats and forged documents. "What about the silver?" Jed asked, though he already suspected the answer from his brother's satisfied expression. "Belongs to the people who own the land," Tommy replied firmly. "The territorial governments established mining cooperatives for the smaller homesteaders, ensuring fair prices and honest dealing. No more outside syndicates buying up properties through deception and violence. It was a victory that went beyond personal vindication. It represented a fundamental shift in how the territory would handle its natural resources, prioritizing the rights of residents over the profits of distant speculators. The mountains would still give up their silver, but the wealth would stay in the communities that had earned it through generations of hard living and honest work." Duke suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked toward the trail that wound down from Eagle Pass. A moment later, Sheriff Morrison appeared on horseback, his badge catching the morning sun and his expression carrying the comfortable authority of a lawman whose jurisdiction finally extended to justice rather than just keeping the peace. "Morning, folks," Morrison called as he approached the cabin. "Got the final word from the federal prosecutor in Helena. Santos was convicted on all counts: conspiracy, attempted murder, fraud. He'll be spending the next 20 years breaking rocks in the territorial prison, assuming he lives that long." The news brought a sense of closure that Jed hadn't realized he'd been waiting for. Miguel Santos would face the consequences of his choices, spending the best years of his remaining life paying for the pain he'd inflicted on innocent people. "Any word on the other members of his gang?" Tommy asked. "Dead or scattered," Morrison replied with satisfaction. "Turns out, Clara wasn't the only one who decided to eliminate her criminal partners when things started going wrong. Honor among thieves is a myth when real money's involved." As the morning wore on and his visitors shared coffee and conversation, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not the desperate happiness of a man grasping at temporary pleasures, but the deep satisfaction of someone whose life had found its proper balance again. The mountains hadn't changed. They remained as beautiful and indifferent as ever, eternal witnesses to human struggles that played out against their granite faces like brief shadows. But Jed's relationship with them had been restored, his connection to the land and community renewed through trials that had tested everything he thought he knew about loyalty and betrayal. Duke's tail thumped against the porch boards as Tommy reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, the three of them forming a picture of family bonds that transcended blood relationships. The German shepherd had never doubted, never wavered, never considered abandoning his post beside a broken man's wheelchair. His loyalty had been rewarded with the restoration of the pack he'd protected through its darkest days. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the valley, Jed realized that Clara's greatest failure wasn't in choosing greed over love or betrayal over loyalty. Her greatest failure was in underestimating the strength that could be found in the very bonds she'd been so eager to break: the connections between man and dog, brother and brother, community and land, that formed the true wealth of the mountains.